Hi everyone, Cutie Pie Sensei here. If you're new around here, welcome. If you're not new around here, welcome back. If you're into gaming and haven't been living under a rock, you've probably heard of League of Legends' newest champion, Senna. She's a badass. So I was lucky enough to be asked by Riot to make her costume. So I'm here today to share that process with you. While Senna's lore does have a bit of a tragic backstory, her being able to eventually gain control of the darkness that kind of had her imprisoned makes her a really awesome character. So I'm super glad that I get the chance to cosplay her, especially since she's also League of Legends' first black female character. Obviously, I'm gonna do that. Few things before we get started. Number one, this tutorial is not meant for beginners. If you have never made a cosplay before, this is not for you. There's a lot of steps when you're making this costume where I assume that you've already done it before, so you kind of know the gist of it, so I skip over it entirely, and I don't want you to miss out and be confused. Number two, because this is not meant for beginners, I end up using tools and materials that the average beginner cosplayer might not have. For instance, I use an airbrush as well as a 3D printer. But don't fret and don't let that scare you. If you don't have a 3D printer or an airbrush, you can still make the costume. In fact, the actual wearable part of the costume doesn't even use the 3D printer, it just uses the airbrush, so you can kind of get away with hand painting that. And the 3D printer is primarily just used on the weapon, so you can still make that out of foam. It'll just be a different process than what I used. Number three, I will leave time codes in the description box. That way you don't have to listen to me ramble and you can go to the parts you actually care about. And last but not least, please like, comment, share, and subscribe if you want to see this face again and more tutorials and stuff like this. Now that's all out of the way, let's get started. So before we get in too deep, I do want to talk about fabric. For this costume, I used a white faux leather, matte gray spandex, gold vinyl spandex, a burgundy faux suede, and a charcoal gray faux leather spandex for the main body of the costume. While her outfit lays like real leather, her gloves fit extremely snug in a way that's only possible for spandex, so I thought fit and color was more important than matching the fabric texture exactly. Please do not purchase upholstery faux leather when you get fabric for this costume because you'll find a bunch of it, but it'll be wrong. For my boot base, I use these riding boots as they have a zipper in the front, which will be easily hidden by the design, as well as they have a similar sole to hers. To pattern the actual boot, we're going to add some craft foam to the back to get the silhouette shape a little closer, and then cover everything in saran wrap and masking tape. We're going to draw the official pattern on top, leaving the white cover part for later. And once you have this pattern, you're going to cut it out and trace it on a craft foam pieces, and then cover those craft foam pieces with fabric. Make sure before you start gluing on the pattern pieces that you sew on a craft foam silhouette shaper on the back of the boot. We're going to use covered craft foam instead of just fabric to help hide indentations from the base shoe from showing through the fabric. And once you start layering your pieces up, you'll get a little something that looks like this. And you'll see in a second that I painted the bottom of the shoes white with gesso because it's a bit rubbery, so it's not going to flake off. And to pattern the top of the shoe, I did just like before. I used masking tape to draw the overall shape I wanted and cut it out of craft foam and fabric and then attach that to the shoe too. So you end up with something like this. For the buckles on the side, I cut out layers of trapezoids from 2 and 4mm craft foam. I stacked them and glued the layers together and trimmed the edges to make them nice and neat. And then I covered them in Plasti Dip and painted them gold. Here, I'm attaching them to the white cover of the boot with just super glue. I know that they're weathered and I'll cover that part later in the video. Also, you can see at this point that I already added the straps. They're pretty straightforward and they're attached with snaps. After the buckles are completely glued on though, you are going to be officially done and you have Senna's shoe. Isn't that awesome? To make a pattern for the pants, you're going to take a pair of leggings that already fit you well and trace the front and back of them, as well as the length of the waistband. Make sure you add a consistent seam allowance so you'll have room to sew. Once traced, sew the front and the back of each leg together and then sew them together at the crotch. For the waistband, fold the fabric over a piece of 2-inch elastic that is a couple of centimeters shorter than the length of the waistband. Sew this closed and then attach it to the leggings. Once finished, you should have a pair of leggings that fit you pretty well. Make adjustments as needed though. I use white fabric because it's easy to draw on top of to make specific pattern sections like the arches on her thighs. You can cut those out to trace and use when you make the final leggings now that you know how it fits. Make sure when you sew the final, you offset the center seam slightly as hers isn't perfectly centered, as well as add this rectangle underneath the waistband in the front. I just applied it on top before I attached the waistband. To pattern her top, I took my dress form, making sure it was the same measurements as me, and covered it in saran wrap and masking tape. Make sure when you do this step, you use the same bra that you plan to use when you wear the costume, and take care to wrap the masking tape as close as you can to the form, especially in the middle of the cleavage. If you can get it really close there, you're able to actually get a dip in there and avoid the typical uniboob look that you can sometimes get when you stretch spandex over boobs. So from here, I just freehanded the pattern, making sure it fit me in the right areas, and traced over the areas I wanted with Sharpie. After you draw it all out, you'll get something that looks like this. Number your pieces, draw connecting lines, and cut out your pattern. Don't cut darts into the breast piece, just try to flatten it as much as you can. The stretch from the spandex will make up for the slight lack in accuracy, and from here you can assemble your pattern. The top is in layers, so I made this diagram to show how I handled the seams of the sections that lie on top. I'd fold the seam allowance underneath, baste in place, and then stitch close to the edge. Basting spray kept me from using pins, which would leave visible holes in this type of fabric. To layer it on top of a section, what I would do is spray basting spray on the back of it, let it get tacky, and then just apply the underlayer accordingly. To permanently attach the pieces, just stitch on top of the seam made from the fold over step. Once sewn, it should look something like this. It's still missing some parts though, so let's go ahead and finish this up. To pattern the extra pieces on the top, apply masking tape while wearing it and draw a general outline of the shape you want over the areas where they need to go. Take the tape off, apply to a flat surface, and add details to the pattern. I use this pattern to then cut flat shapes out of craft foam, make the appropriate markings on them, and then dremel the edges to give the pieces some more depth. A cool trick I figured out to securely attach craft foam pieces to clothing is to trace the outline of the shape you want to attach on 1mm craft foam and sew that in place. Now that there's a piece of craft foam there, you can apply contact cement to that foam without messing up the clothing to securely glue the foam pieces in place. The final look has all the security of sewing, but with no stitch lines. For the center diamond piece, I covered the diamond shape I dremeled with, you guessed it, masking tape. I drew on top, used that as a pattern for some fabric, and then covered the diamond in fabric. Now I'm just hand stitching it in place on top. All you gotta do now is add straps to the sides and you're done. Look at that, you got a top. Okay, so I was done when I made the gloves and thought my camera was recording when it wasn't, so this section is going to be diagrams. So first, lay out your fabric, doubled with the stretch going across. Lay out onto your fabric and trace around your hand and your arm via the preschool Thanksgiving hand turkey method. This is a guide, but you'll actually be stitching slightly outside of that line when going around the arm. Notice though that it gets very close to the initial guidelines when going around the fingers. The seam allowance size for this doesn't really matter that much, just make sure you have one. Cut out both halves of the glove and stitch them together via the white guidelines I illustrated earlier. Once everything is stitched in place, you'll have a glove with an unfinished top. Mark where you want the tops to meet the gloves and cut 1/2 inch above that for a seam allowance. Use the top of your glove to pattern out the diagonal white top pieces. Sew each quadrant together until the whole top is assembled, and then fold the top seam allowance down to hem the edge. Attach this to the top of your glove within both seam allowances and you should have a finished glove. This may look weird, but I have a duct tape dummy of my arm to more easily draw gauntlet patterns and things. I used this covered in our favorite saran wrap and tape to draw out the gold piece that goes around her glove. I cut this apart and used it as a pattern for craft foam and then covered that foam in fabric. Those pieces were then attached via Super 77 glue. To make the accessory bits, I got the general measurements of the size I wanted via just holding a ruler to my body and then just freehanded the patterns until they looked right. It's not super fancy, I know, but that's what I did. I traced all my patterns out onto foam, cut and glued the appropriate layers, and then dremeled them to get some dimension. So, you go from something like this to this. I really do think that dremeling adds a lot of just overall character to the pieces. To paint them, I cover the pieces in plastic dip and gold spray paint as a base, and then to get the weathered look, I add brown acrylic paint to any recessed areas, as well as the underside where shadows would fall most of the time. Small touches like that really makes things pop and gives it more contrast, kind of like when you use makeup to, contour your face. The cape required a lot of draping and seam ripping to get the pattern for, so I'm just going to show you what I landed on. You can pause the video if you'd like to study the pattern and exact measurements that I ended up using. Before I cut the pattern apart, I traced the pieces onto the faux suede as the inside of the cape is very simple. I then cut the pieces out at the appropriate seams on the pattern and used that to cut out the right pieces for the white parts of the cape. Before you do anything else, this is the best time to do the weathering on the vinyl. Right now, our vinyl is a little bit too perfect looking and we want it to look a little worn and grungy. So I went in with layers of gray and brown and patchy spots on my white fabric, and then while the paint was still damp, I dabbed at it with sponges in different areas. This leaves us with a more accurate and textured look. Once you're done, it should look like this. And this is what the cape looks like when it's all, worn and grungy and also sewn together. Put the pattern back together and cut out the applique pattern for the gold. Cut it out of the fabric, leaving a seam allowance, fold the edges under, and stitch it in place to have a super neat applique to apply. Once your applique is done, stitch it in place onto the back of the white cape fabric. Line up your suede lining with the white cape fabric and draw the jagged worn bottom to it. Cut these pieces together and stitch them very close to the edge to close the cape off at the bottom. Assemble the hood pieces next, leaving the bottom of the hood open. Attach the hood to the cape by first attaching the white parts of both the cape and the hood, and then hand stitch the lining. You can't really see how she has her cape closed because her hair mostly covers it, so for ease of wear, I just stitched on some store-bought clasps and then super glued a craft foam design that I just made up that I thought fit the motif. The people at Riot were so gracious as to provide me with a 3D model of Senna's weapon, which means you guys get a 3D model of Senna's weapon. Senna's weapon is rather large, and while I'm not making it bigger than me, I still wanted the final product to be 57 inches long, which is still pretty big, so we're only going to print the handle pieces, and I'm going to make the barrel by hand to save on filament as well as the overall weight and print time. In order to print something so big though, we had to slice it in sections that were able to fit onto our print bed. Our print bed is 15 inches in diameter, so we were able to print in relatively large chunks, but that may vary for you depending on your printer specs. We also added slots and pegs to each slice section so the pieces could more securely connect to each other and be stable under all of that weight. This here is just a shot so you can see how large this piece really was. It took 48 hours to print, and it's only 1/2 of one section on the handle, and there were 7 more. So look how freaking huge this is. We also had spaces underneath to install flattened PVC pipe that was super glued in place so the barrel could have a sturdy connection point to the handle. These points connect to 2 longer PVC pipes that each go through one section of the barrel. I printed out a general map I drew of the barrel and then blew it up to the dimensions that I wanted. And I then used that whole thing as a pattern to cut out a base of pink insulation foam and EVA foam. I hot glued the PVC pipe into the insulation foam, and it's pretty sturdy, and you can see where it would connect to the actual handle. Next, we want to completely cover the insulation foam with the EVA foam and the outside edges with 2mm craft foam. So to secure it in place, I just sprayed a whole bunch of Super 77 spray on the pink insulation foam, and then I used contact cement where the craft foam and the EVA foam met out. So you see it's all covered now. So next, you're going to draw out just where you need to Dremel. So just get your Dremel lines on the base shape. And then once you got that, you're going to cut out the individual broken up stone pieces and map out where those go so you don't lose your place. And draw them out on 5mm craft foam. And then we're going to Dremel the heck out of this. And then once you have those placed in place, you just contact cement it down. Once this is plasti dipped, you want to get the marbling effect. And to do this on both the white and black sections, alternate with your base color and a contrasting color in layers. Streak on the contrast color first, blend it out with a sponge a little bit and the base color, and repeat, lessening the blending as you go up in layers. I used a feather actually to get some of the initial streaks because it helps make a more natural looking effect. And on the black, I actually used a blue paint instead of a gray paint for the contrast color. Makes it more interesting. For the gold like marble accents on the edges, I ended up using a brown paint first, and then I went over that brown paint in a gold metallic paint marker to make it stand out a little bit more. Once we sanded all of the 3D printed pieces, we super glued them together, primed with filler primer, and painted with a basic metallic gold spray paint. Just like with the accessories, I added brown to the recessed parts of the gold to help intensify the contrast. Once painted, snap the bottom section in place. This was left for last so all the pieces could be painted thoroughly. Attach the barrel and you're done. Now you are officially a badass. Congratulations. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope this helped you out and gave you the confidence to make your own Senna costume. If you have any questions that I didn't answer in the video, feel free to leave them in the comment section below and I will answer them accordingly. Bye!